I go to seek a great perhaps. François Rabelais, the French Renaissance writer, left us this enigmatic line as his supposed last words. And when Miles Halter, the 16-year-old protagonist of John Green's Looking for Alaska, chooses to leave the safe, suffocating suburbs of Florida for a boarding school in Alabama, he adopts this phrase as his mission statement. He wants, as he says, not just the answers to trivia, but the answers to everything. Miles is a collector of last words, fascinated by the way people crystallize a life into a sentence. And Rabelais's words become both prophecy and challenge. Go find your great perhaps, whatever that means. From the very first page, the book unsettled me. It wasn't just teenage angst or the familiar coming-of-age tropes. It was that haunting pull toward mystery, toward tragedy, toward the idea that sometimes you must leave the familiar not because you hate it but because you need to be jolted awake. I read those first pages, and I felt, in some eerie way, that I was back in my own teenage bedroom, staring at a ceiling fan that spun endlessly, wondering when life would finally begin. Miles gave words to that restlessness, and then, of course, there is Culver Creek, the boarding school. A place that is neither paradise nor prison, but a crucible where everything is intensified: friendship, pranks, loyalty, heartbreak. Green paints it with such specificity: the smoking hole in the woods, the eagle, the stern dean of students, the labyrinthine dorm rooms that you can almost smell the mix of rain, mud, and adolescent sweat. If you've ever been in a place that felt too small for your growing heart, you'll recognize it instantly. But let me pause here. Because the real magnet of this story, the reason I kept turning the pages at a ridiculous pace, is Alaska Young. How do I even begin to describe her? Miles, who quickly earns the nickname Pudge thanks to his ironic skinniness, is bewitched by her from the first moment. She had the kind of eyes that predisposed you to supporting her every endeavor, he tells us. She smiled with all her teeth, but the smile was forced, as if she had practiced it. Alaska is reckless, brilliant, mercurial, and frustratingly enigmatic. She drinks too much, smokes constantly, and seems to live perched on the edge of a cliff, daring the world to push her. Yet she also devours books, speaks with wit sharp enough to cut glass, and keeps a personal library stacked high in her dorm room. Miles, and let's be honest, most readers too, falls for her not just because of her beauty but because she embodies that wild, intoxicating mixture of chaos and wisdom. She is the great perhaps incarnate. Now, I know what you're thinking. Haven't we seen this before? The manic pixie dream girl archetype, the dazzling but doomed young woman who exists mainly to shake up the male protagonist. And yes, you could accuse John Green of that. Critics have. But when I read Alaska, I didn't see her as a shallow archetype. I saw her as a tragic contradiction, a girl too large for the world she was born into, a girl who couldn't contain the weight of her own sadness. She wasn't there to save Miles. She was there to remind us that sometimes the most magnetic people are also the most broken. There is one line Alaska says early on that pierced me: "Y'all smoke to enjoy it. I smoke to die." On the surface, it's flippant, even edgy in that teenage way. But beneath it is a terrifying honesty. For me, that moment stripped away any illusion that this story would be light-hearted. This was a book about mortality, about the unexplainable impulses that drive us, about the fine line between living recklessly and dying young, and yet it's also funny. The Colonel, Miles's fiercely loyal and sharp-tongued roommate, provides some of the best comic relief in the novel. His elaborate pranks, his deadpan comebacks, his love of loyalty over wealth, it all balances the darker themes. One of my favorite exchanges is when the Colonel introduces himself with unapologetic bluntness. "I'm the Colonel, that's not your name." "Well, it's the name I gave myself, Colonel, because I'm the commander of this fine army of one." The Colonel, unlike Miles, doesn't worship Alaska. He sees her flaws, rolls his eyes at her drama, but loves her anyway. And maybe that's the truest kind of love, the kind that doesn't require blindness. When I first encountered this book, I was unprepared for how personal it would feel. It isn't just about teenagers at a boarding school. It's about the labyrinth of suffering that life presents us. There's a recurring theme in the novel, a question Alaska herself poses after reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez's The General in his Labyrinth. How will I ever get out of this labyrinth? That question haunted me. Because isn't that what we all ask, in some form? How do we escape suffering? How do we make sense of grief, of injustice, of our own self-destructive tendencies? Alaska believes the labyrinth is suffering itself. Miles believes it is life, complicated and painful, but worth enduring. The book doesn't give us easy answers, and that's exactly why it lingers in the mind. Reading Looking for Alaska as an adult is different from reading it as a teenager. Back then, I would have swooned over Alaska's rebellion, her midnight escapades, her ability to turn every ordinary moment into something electric. Now, I feel a deeper sadness. I see the warning signs, the despair disguised as bravado, the way her friends orbit her brilliance without realizing how close she is to burning out. It's the tragedy of watching someone sprint toward the edge of a cliff while you stand frozen, unable to stop them, but before tragedy strikes. The novel allows us to bask in moments of pure teenage exuberance, the late-night runs, the prank wars, the taste of illicit wine under the stars. These passages pulse with a vitality that made me nostalgic for the kind of freedom that only exists before adulthood clamps down with its endless responsibilities, and here is where John Green's writing shines. He doesn't romanticize every moment. He punctures the beauty with awkwardness, with crude jokes, with the reminder that teenagers are still just teenagers, brilliant in bursts, foolish in others. He respects them enough to show their contradictions. There's a scene that always makes me smile. Alaska challenges Miles to a game of truth or dare. He, awkward and inexperienced, is terrified she might demand something scandalous. Instead, she dares him to hook up with a girl. When he stammers, she laughs, calls him adorable, and suddenly the tension deflates into humor. That's what adolescence is, fear and hilarity tangled together. When people ask me why Looking for Alaska still matters, nearly 2 decades after its release, I point to that exact blend. It's a book unafraid to wrestle with suffering, yet unwilling to surrender to despair. It tells us that grief will come, yes, but so will laughter. That love is intoxicating but also bewildering. That sometimes the people we idolize will disappoint us. And sometimes they will break our hearts beyond repair, and perhaps most importantly, it tells us that searching for meaning, the great perhaps, is itself meaningful. Even if we never fully arrive. As turn the pages of the first half of the book. Before the event, and readers know what I mean, I felt a mounting sense of dread. The chapters are literally divided into before and after, and Green counts down the days. 136 days before, 120 days before. It's like watching a clock tick closer to midnight. You don't know exactly what's coming, but you know it's coming. That structure forces you to live with impending tragedy the way we all do in real life, always a little aware that everything could change in an instant. The countdown was, for me, one of the most brilliant narrative devices. It transforms even light-hearted moments into bittersweet ones. You laugh at a prank, but in the corner of your mind you're thinking, how many days until the world cracks open? That is adolescence in a nutshell, isn't it? Moments of wild laughter balanced on the knife edge of fragility. When we talk about adolescence, we often sugarcoat it. We imagine a series of heartwarming coming-of-age milestones. The first kiss, the best friends forever, the memories you'll cherish when you're old and gray. But John Green doesn't give us sugar. He gives us the raw, awkward, exhilarating truth. And in Looking for Alaska, that truth often smells like cigarette smoke, stale beer, and a dash of teenage recklessness. There's a recurring image in the novel that stayed with me, the smoking hole. It's exactly what it sounds like, a secret spot in the woods where Alaska, the Colonel, Miles, and the others gather to puff through packs of cigarettes and plot their schemes. For them, it's not just a hideout. It's a sanctuary. It's where they confess fears, trade insults, and, without realizing it, form the bonds that will define them. We smoked the afternoon away. It was a good day. It was a good life. When I first read that line, I laughed. Because let's be honest, no one ever actually says, it was a good life while sitting in a muddy ditch inhaling toxins. But that's the beauty of being 16, you can declare meaning in the most unlikely of places. The smoking hole becomes their cathedral, their caf, their therapy couch. It reminded me of those teenage places I once had, the half-finished basement where we played loud music, or the parking lot behind the grocery store where we sat on car hoods until nothing about those spaces was beautiful, but they were ours. And that made them sacred. The friendships in Looking for Alaska are the spine of the story. Miles, awkward and wide-eyed, finds in the Colonel a mentor of sorts. Someone who knows the ropes of Culver Creek and isn't afraid to stand up to the weekday warriors, the rich kids who only board during the week and lord their privilege over everyone else. The Colonel is fiercely loyal, especially to his mother, whom he adores. There's something disarming about his toughness. It's not cruelty, it's protection. He may plot elaborate revenge schemes, but underneath he's just a boy who wants justice in a world stacked against him. And then there's Takumi, the sly, understated member of the group, who always seems to know more than he lets on. He's like the narrator behind the narrator, quietly observing, occasionally dropping a truth bomb, and then fading into the background again. His presence reminds us that friendship doesn't always mean being loudest in the room. Sometimes it's about being the one who listens. But of course, everything circles back to Alaska. She's the sun they orbit, the gravitational force that pulls them together and threatens to burn them all. There's a scene where she and Miles sit together in her dorm room, and she shows him her towering stacks of books. She calls it her life's library. When I look at my shelves, I see my unfinished life. I want to read them all, but I'll never have the time. That line hit me like a brick. Because who among us doesn't feel that panic, the awareness of mortality pressed into the spines of unread books? Alaska's library isn't just a quirky hobby. It's a metaphor for her restless soul, her sense that life will always be too short for the hunger she feels. She hoards stories the way some people hoard secrets, desperately, as if each one might finally explain the labyrinth she's trapped in. Miles is captivated, of course. He sees in Alaska not just a girl, but a doorway into a life that feels larger, riskier, more electric than his own. And isn't that what so many of us do at that age? We project our longing onto someone who seems to embody freedom, only to realize later that they, too, are fighting demons. One of the most bittersweet aspects of the novel is its humor. The prank wars between the Colonel's group and the weekday warriors are legendary. Green describes them with almost slapstick detail. The freezing of dorm rooms, the elaborate water balloon ambushes, the payback schemes. At one point, they soak a whole row of warrior dorm rooms with industrial-strength blue dye. It's absurd, chaotic, and hilarious. And yet it's also deadly serious. These pranks are a way of reclaiming dignity, of fighting back against injustice in the only way teenagers know how. The only thing worse than being poor at Culver Creek is being poor and quiet. The Colonel says this with the conviction of someone who knows the hierarchy all too well. Laughter becomes their weapon. Mischief becomes their revolution. Now, I should confess something. When I first read this book, I didn't entirely get Alaska. I was annoyed with her impulsiveness, her contradictions, her habit of lashing out at the people who loved her. I wanted her to be consistent, reliable. But of course, that's the point. She isn't consistent. She's as volatile as a firework, and that volatility is exactly what makes her unforgettable. There's a moment where Miles finally musters the courage to ask her, half-jokingly, why she acts the way she does. Her response is both cutting and profound. I'm a deeply unhappy person, Pudge. I don't know why. I try to be different, but it's just not working. That's not the kind of confession you expect from a teenage novel. It's the raw voice of depression, of existential exhaustion, coming from a character who is otherwise vibrant and reckless. And it made me pause. Because how many of us knew someone like that growing up, someone who could light up a room and simultaneously seemed unreachable in their sadness? Green refuses to give us a clean narrative. He doesn't package Alaska as a cautionary tale or a glamorous martyr. He lets her contradictions stand. She can be cruel and kind, selfish and generous, brilliant and careless, all in the span of an afternoon. And that's why she feels real. The countdown chapters continue. 99 days before, 87 days before. each one pulls us closer to the inevitable. And as the numbers shrink, the friendships deepen. There's an unforgettable Thanksgiving scene where Miles, instead of going home, stays at Culver Creek with Alaska. They cobble together a makeshift holiday microwaved food, cheap wine, laughter echoing through empty dorm halls. It's messy, imperfect, and yet somehow more meaningful than any polished family dinner. We had nothing, but it felt like everything. That, to me, is adolescence distilled. You don't need candlelit tables or fine china. You need someone to sit with you in the chaos, to make you feel like your existence matters. Alaska and Miles share a kind of intimacy that isn't about physical closeness so much as shared loneliness. They are two souls peering over the edge of the same abyss, hoping the other might have a rope. And then there's the famous game of best day or worst day. Alaska asks everyone to share their extremes. The Colonel talks about the day he and his mother were evicted from their trailer. Miles talks about the loneliness of his early high school years. But Alaska's answers cut the deepest. Her best day, the day her mother took her to the zoo. Her worst day, the day her mother died in front of her when she was 8, and she froze, unable to call 911. When she tells this story, you understand everything and nothing at once. The reckless behavior, the self-destruction, the cigarette smoke like a dare to the universe, all of it is rooted in that childhood trauma. And yet, no revelation makes her easier to solve. She remains a labyrinth. As a reader, I felt helpless. I wanted to step into the page, shake her shoulders, tell her that 8-year-old guilt should never define a life. But of course, that's not how pain works. Trauma doesn't respond to reason. It festers, shapes, distorts. And in Alaska, it manifests as both brilliance and recklessness, light and shadow. The novel asks us to sit with that discomfort, to resist the temptation to fix or explain, to love people even when they're messy, even when they're hard to understand. One of John Green's greatest strengths as a writer is that he trusts his readers. He doesn't spoon-feed us morals. He doesn't tidy up the chaos. Instead, he invites us into the smoking hole, hands us a cheap beer, and asks us to listen to the jokes, the tears, the silences. And as the countdown ticked closer, I found myself dreading the after. I didn't want the days to run out. I wanted Alaska to stay in her dorm room with her mountains of books, forever plotting her next prank, forever dazzling and infuriating her friends. But literature doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. We can't freeze time, no matter how much we want to. The thing about countdowns is that they trick you. Each chapter in Looking for Alaska starts with a number, 62 days before, 21 days before, and so on. It's simple math, and yet, as you read, you begin to feel a tightening in your chest. Because you know you're not counting down to a birthday party or summer vacation. You're counting down to catastrophe. Every laugh, every dare, every prank is shadowed by the knowledge that something irreversible is waiting at 0, and yet, the characters don't know. They keep living as if the universe owes them infinite tomorrows. That gap between what we know as readers and what they know as teenagers is where the tragedy sharpens its teeth. There's a passage I underlined 3 times. Imagining the future is a kind of nostalgia. You spend your whole life stuck in the labyrinth, thinking about how you'll escape it one day, and how awesome it will be, and imagining that future keeps you going. But you never do it. You just use the future to escape the present. That's Alaska speaking, and if I'm honest, it could be me speaking too. Or maybe you. How often do we use the idea of someday as a shield? Someday I'll travel. Someday I'll write that book. Someday I'll be happy. Alaska calls out that illusion with brutal clarity. And she's only 17. When I was 17, I was still figuring out eyeliner. What John Green captures so well is the oscillation of teenage life, the way one moment can be philosophical, drenched in metaphysics, and the next can be absurdly trivial. One minute, Alaska is debating suffering and salvation. The next, she's teasing Miles about his pathetic dating history. It's jarring, but it's real. Life doesn't hand us themes neatly packaged. It throws profundity and silliness into the same 10 minutes. And poor Miles, dear Pudge, is constantly caught between awe and bewilderment. He's intoxicated by Alaska's intensity, but he's also hopelessly inexperienced. There's that infamous scene where she teaches him how to kiss. The instructions are so matter-of-fact, so oddly tender. When you use tongue, you're supposed to move it around. But don't stick your tongue down her throat or anything. You just sort of move it. It's clumsy, awkward, almost clinical, and yet it becomes this strangely poignant rite of passage. I laughed when I read it, but I also remembered my own teenage clumsiness. Those first encounters with intimacy that feel monumental and ridiculous all at once. What strikes me is that Miles doesn't really want Alaska just for physical attraction. What he wants is her aliveness, her unfiltered existence. He wants to catch some of that lightning in his own empty jar. And in that sense, his love is both genuine and selfish. Genuine, because he truly sees her brilliance. Selfish, because he projects his own hunger for meaning onto her, as if she is responsible for filling his emptiness. The Colonel, wiser in his own way, calls him out on this. He warns Miles not to idealize her, not to confuse Alaska's chaos with depth. But Miles can't help himself. He's too far gone. There's a delicate balance here that I think many readers miss. Yes, Alaska is magnetic. Yes, she's tragic. But John Green also critiques the way we romanticize people, especially women, into metaphors. Miles sees Alaska not as she is, but as the great perhaps he CRAVs. And isn't that something we all do at some point, turn someone else into our escape hatch, only to be crushed when we discover they are human, fragile, mortal? The pranks escalate as the countdown continues. One of my favorites is the Lara prank. They recruit Lara, the shy Romanian student, into their schemes, and suddenly the group expands. There's a sweetness in watching Lara and Miles fumble their way toward connection. She's patient, kind, and unlike Alaska, she doesn't hide behind riddles or smokescreens. Her presence forces Miles to confront the possibility that affection doesn't always have to be an insolvable puzzle. Sometimes, love can be steady instead of stormy. But let's be honest, when you're 16, steady love rarely wins. The storm is too seductive. One of the most haunting conversations in the book comes late one night, when Alaska and Miles are lying in her dorm room, whispering into the dark. She asks him what he fears most. He admits, timidly, that he fears oblivion, that terrifying idea that one day, everyone you love will die, and eventually, even their memories will vanish. Until the universe forgets you ever existed. Alaska responds with a ferocity that startled me. The only way out of the labyrinth of suffering is to forgive. Forgiveness for others. For yourself, for the past that cannot be undone. She speaks it like a revelation, and yet you sense she hasn't actually forgiven herself. Not for her mother's death, not for the ways she sabotages her own joy. It's easy to preach forgiveness. It's far harder to practice it. That night, reading that passage, I had to close the book. Because it's not just Alaska's dilemma. It's ours. How many of us carry guilt like a stone in our pocket, rubbing it smooth with years of repetition, convinced that letting it go would somehow dishonor the weight of it? Forgiveness feels like betrayal. And yet, Alaska is right. It's also the only way to keep breathing. And so, the labyrinth metaphor deepens. For Alaska, the labyrinth is suffering itself. For Miles, the labyrinth is life, messy and painful, but survivable. For me, the labyrinth is perhaps the human condition, the tangle of desire, grief, joy, and fear that we stumble through without a map. Meanwhile, Green laces all this philosophy with laughter. There's a scene where the Colonel and Miles hatch an elaborate scheme to trick the eagle. They create diversions, fake alibis, and at one point, nearly blow the whole operation by bursting into uncontrollable giggles. I loved this because it reminded me that adolescence is not just pain and longing. It's also ridiculous, slapstick comedy performed in dirty sneakers. The tonal shifts are what make the novel brilliant. Without the humor, it would be unbearable. Without the tragedy, it would be shallow. Together, they create something truer than either extreme could offer alone. As the numbers dwindle 5 days before, 3 days before, the narrative itself becomes taut with suspense. Even if you don't know what's coming, you know it's coming. The language sharpens, the nights grow heavier, and Alaska becomes more restless. She flits from joy to despair with increasing volatility, as if she can hear the countdown in her bones. And then comes the moment that is both ordinary and prophetic, a night of drinking games, laughter, confessions, a blur of alcohol and cigarettes. Alaska kisses Miles. For him, it's the culmination of months of longing, the ultimate validation that he wasn't foolish to love her. For her, it's something else. Maybe comfort, maybe escape, maybe just a fleeting decision made under the haze of intoxication. The line that gutted me is when Miles reflects on that kiss afterward. At the time, it felt like the beginning of something. Later, I realized it was the end. How many of our lives can be summarized in that paradox? The moments we thought were beginnings that were actually endings. The doors we thought we were opening that were, in fact, slamming shut, and so, the countdown reaches its final hours. Alaska, restless and drunk, receives a mysterious phone call. She panics, demands that Miles and the Colonel help her distract the Eagle so she can drive off campus. They comply, half drunk themselves, not realizing the gravity of what they're enabling. This is the knife twist of the novel. Tragedy doesn't arrive with fanfare. It sneaks in through ordinary stupidity, through poor judgment made at a It's not a grand destiny. It's a car crash. And yet, for Miles, for all of us reading, it feels mythic. We don't yet see the crash. We only see her leaving, headlights cutting through the dark, Alaska speeding toward her labyrinth. But the next chapter is titled, simply, After, and our stomachs drop. The book splits in two like a broken bone. Before and after, that stark division. A single word at the top of the page hits harder than any description could. We don't see Alaska die. We only hear the echo, the aftermath, the jagged silence she leaves behind. And in that silence, the labyrinth shifts for everyone. The morning after that fateful night, Miles and the Colonel are still groggy from drinking when the Eagle summons them. They stumble into his office, not prepared for the words that fall like stones. Alaska is dead. A car accident. Instant. Irrevocable. Green doesn't dramatize the announcement with long speeches. It's blunt, brutal. Because in real life, that's how death news arrives. A sentence. A flat tone. The world collapses, and yet the sentence still fits into a handful of words. Miles's reaction is devastating in its simplicity. He doesn't believe it. He refuses. He replays the night in his head. The kiss, the phone call, the desperate urgency in her eyes. He convinces himself that she can't be gone, not Alaska, not the force of nature who filled every room with chaos. He says, I know so many last words, but I will never know hers. That line wrecked me. Here is a boy obsessed with famous last words, who collected them like trophies, and the one person he loves most slips away without giving him hers. The irony is cruel. The absence is louder than any quote could be. The Colonel, on the other hand, reacts with rage. He punches walls, screams at the unfairness, turns his anger outward while Miles turns his inward. The two of them become a study in grief's contradictions, one paralyzed by guilt, the other consumed by fury. Both lost in the labyrinth, stumbling in opposite directions. I remember reading this section and feeling my own chest tighten. Because grief is never neat. It's messy, contradictory, and cruel. You laugh at a memory 1 second and collapse into tears the next. You hate the person for leaving you and ache for them in the same breath. Green captures that chaos with uncanny precision. There's a scene where Miles sits alone, trying to reconstruct every detail of the night Alaska left. He replays the kiss, the urgency, the smell of her perfume. He convinces himself he should have stopped her, should have asked more questions, should have realized she was too drunk to drive. The guilt wraps around him like barbed wire. If people were rain, I was drizzle and she was a hurricane. That metaphor, so famous now it adorns posters and tattoos, is more than teenage melodrama. It's the language of survivor's guilt. Drizzle cannot hold back a hurricane. And yet Miles blames himself anyway. Because that's what we do. We rewrite the past in our minds, imagining we could have been saviors if only we had been wiser, braver, louder. The Colonel, meanwhile, throws himself into obsession of a different kind, figuring out how she died. Was it suicide? Was it an accident? Did she mean to crash? They interrogate classmates, pore over evidence, even retrace her drive. It becomes a desperate detective story, not because they need the truth, but because they can't live with uncertainty. They think that solving the riddle will somehow ease the ache. But grief doesn't work like that. Answers rarely heal. The school reacts with a blend of formality and avoidance. The Eagle enforces stricter rules, counselors hover, but the students are left adrift. Alaska, with all her contradictions, becomes a legend overnight. Stories circulate. Some romanticize her, some vilify her, but all distort her. Because that's what happens when someone dies young, they become myth, stripped of their human messiness. Miles resists that mythologizing. He clings to the Alaska who made sarcastic jokes, who kissed him with cigarette-stained lips, who confessed her unhappiness at a M. He doesn't want her to be a saint or a cautionary tale. He wants her as she was. Infuriating, luminous, broken. One of the most poignant moments comes when Takumi admits that he, too, carries guilt. He had seen Alaska that night, had spoken with her briefly, and didn't stop her either. For Miles, this confession is both a comfort and a torment. Comfort, because he's not alone in his failure. Torment, because it means more people missed the warning signs. The question of suicide hangs heavy. Alaska's earlier words, "I smoke to die," echo like prophecy. But was that night deliberate? Or was it just recklessness colliding with bad timing? Green doesn't give us certainty. He leaves us in the labyrinth with Miles and the Colonel, where grief gnaws endlessly at the unanswerable, and maybe that's the point. Maybe certainty is overrated. As I read these chapters, I felt transported back to my own first encounter with sudden loss. The absurdity of it. The way the world goes on, people still eat lunch, cars still honk, the sun still rises while your inner world has shattered. Green describes Miles walking across campus, noticing how normal everything looks, and feeling almost offended by it. That rang so true. How dare the world keep spinning when Alaska Young is gone? And yet, slowly, painfully, the world insists. There's a memorial service. Students cry, some genuinely, some performatively. The Colonel and Miles sit in the back, bitter at the hypocrisy. They know Alaska better than the platitudes suggest. They can't stomach the sanitized version of her being recited like scripture. Afterward, the Colonel explodes in one of my favorite rants in the book. He curses the system, curses the universe, curses himself. It's raw, unfiltered, the kind of monologue you can only deliver when your heart is splintering. And while Miles listens, part of him envies the Colonel's anger. Because at least anger feels active. Guilt, on the other hand, just festers. What's remarkable is how Green weaves philosophy into this grief narrative without making it feel contrived. Miles, Alaska, and their friends were always debating meaning, religion, suffering. Now, those abstract questions are no longer academic. They're survival tools, the great perhaps, the labyrinth, the meaning of last words. These aren't just teenage musings anymore. They're the scaffolding Miles clings to in the wreckage. I remember pausing at this point in the book and realizing how cunning Green's structure is. By dividing the story into before and after, he transforms the novel into a meditation on how a single event cleaves a life in two. We all have those moments, don't we? The day before the diagnosis, the night before the phone call, the moment before the accident. Life feels linear until it doesn't, until it fractures. And then there is no going back. For Miles, Alaska's death is that fracture. His adolescence is no longer about seeking a great perhaps. It's about learning how to live in the ruins of lost possibility, and yet, amidst all this darkness, there are glimmers. Laughter still sneaks in. The Colonel still cracks jokes. Takumi still plays the quiet observer. Even in grief, teenagers remain teenagers. They prank, they flirt, they procrastinate homework. It's jarring, almost inappropriate, and yet so very real. Because grief doesn't erase life, it entangles with it. There's one image I can't shake. Miles sitting at the smoking hole. Alone this time, lighting a cigarette not out of rebellion but out of ritual. As if inhaling might summon her ghost. He realizes painfully that the sanctuary is hollow without her, that spaces are not sacred on their own. They're sacred because of the people who fill them. We need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken. That line doesn't come until later, but I carried it with me through the after. It's the heartbeat of the novel. The assurance that even in labyrinths of suffering, some part of us remains unshattered, waiting to grow around the crack. In the weeks after Alaska's death, grief at Culver Creek settles like a fog, thick, damp, and impossible to shake off. Everyone breathes it, but no one breathes the same way. For Miles, it's suffocation. For the Colonel, it's fire. For Takumi, it's silence. The campus, once buzzing with mischief, now echoes with absence. John Green doesn't shy away from showing us the slow corrosion of joy. At first, Miles believes he can't laugh again, can't eat, can't breathe without guilt. When the Colonel cracks a sarcastic joke, Miles feels the laughter rise in his throat like betrayal. And yet laughter comes anyway, awkward and guilty, like a guest who wasn't invited but shows up regardless. You can't just make me different and leave. Because I was fine before, Alaska. I was fine with just me. But you convinced me that I was special, and now you're gone, and I don't know how to be special without you. This is Miles in mourning, confessing that Alaska didn't just leave him. She rewrote him and then abandoned the manuscript half finished. I remember reading that and thinking, isn't that how loss works? People enter our lives and rearrange the furniture of our souls. When they vanish, we're left tripping over the new layout, not sure how to move without bumping into absence. The Colonel channels his grief into obsession. He can't let go of the idea that Alaska's death must be solved like a puzzle. Accident or suicide? Did she crash deliberately, or was it just drunken recklessness? He and Miles conduct late-night investigations, retracing her steps, interrogating the timeline, even visiting the scene of the accident. They want certainty, as if certainty could be a bandage, but Green is too honest a writer to grant them that luxury. The truth remains murky. Their theories crumble, replaced by new ones, which crumble again. And in that cycle of searching and failing, I recognized something painfully human, our refusal to accept that sometimes the labyrinth has no map. There's a heartbreaking conversation between Miles and Dr. Hyde, their religion teacher, who has always been more philosopher than disciplinarian. Miles confesses his fear, his guilt, his inability to forgive himself for letting Alaska leave that night. Dr. Hyde listens, patient and kind, and finally says, "You are now faced with the choice of how you are going to go through life. You can either look for reasons to be angry and miserable, or you can look for reasons to be grateful." It's not a sermon. It's a gentle reminder that grief gives us two roads, bitterness or growth. Hyde doesn't demand that Miles pick gratitude instantly. He simply plants the seed. One of the things I admire about Looking for Alaska is that Green doesn't rush his characters through healing. There's no neat arc where they get over it. Instead, grief lingers, mutates, reshapes itself. Some days, Miles feels almost normal until he sees Alaska's empty chair in class. Some nights, the Colonel seems at peace until a random memory sends him spiraling into rage. That's the truth of loss. It's not linear. It's circular. It sneaks up on you in waves. Meanwhile, life at Culver Creek continues in awkward fits and starts. The eagle still prowls. Classes still meet. Pranks still happen, though less often, less joyfully. And yet, even in grief, teenagers remain teenagers. They gossip, flirt, stress about exams. The absurdity of normal life pressing on after catastrophe is one of the most honest details in the book. There's an especially tender moment when Lara, the sweet Romanian girl who once kissed Miles, reaches out to comfort him. She doesn't demand explanations or offer platitudes. She just sits with him. That small act reminded me that sometimes presence is the only antidote to despair. We can't solve grief for each other, but we can sit in its smoke together. The mystery of Alaska's final moments gnaws at Miles and the Colonel. They learn she had remembered her mother's death anniversary that night. Perhaps the phone call that made her panic was connected to it. Perhaps she was rushing to the cemetery with flowers. The hints point in multiple directions, but never form a clear picture. We never know what happens to us in the end. We only know how it feels to be left behind. That's not a direct line from the book, but it might as well be. Because what Green insists is that absence cannot be solved. It must be lived with. The most remarkable chapter, for me, is the one where the Colonel and Miles, drunk on grief and anger, hatch one final prank in Alaska's honor. They plan to flood the campus with chaos firecrackers, fake love notes, absurd announcements, something so grand it would have made Alaska cackle with delight. The night of the prank, as students scatter in laughter and confusion, Miles feels a sudden rush of joy. For a brief moment, grief loosens its grip, replaced by the dizzying awareness that Alaska would have loved this. It's not healing exactly, but it's communion, a way of keeping her spirit alive through mischief. This reminded me of how we honor those we lose, not just with solemn candles, but with laughter, with traditions, with the things they loved most. To live joyfully in their memory is also an act of love. And then comes the essay assignment. Dr. Hyde asks his students to answer one question. How will you personally ever get out of this labyrinth of suffering? It's the very question that obsessed Alaska, and now it hangs over Miles like a judgment. He wrestles with it, drafts and crumples, despairs at ever finding words that could carry the weight of his grief. But finally, in one of the most beautiful passages in the book, he writes, "We need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken." That line has stayed with me for years. It's not naive optimism. It's a declaration that even in our deepest suffering, something in us remains intact, waiting to grow around the cracks. Grief doesn't erase us. It reshapes us. And though we may stumble through the labyrinth, we are never without the possibility of finding light. When Miles finishes that essay, it doesn't erase his guilt. It doesn't resurrect Alaska, but it gives him a way forward. And maybe that's all grief ever allows. Not closure, but forward motion. I think about my own labyrinth's losses, regrets, the nights I've lain awake replaying mistakes I can't undo. This book didn't give me answers, but it gave me companionship. It reminded me that suffering is universal, but so is resilience. That even hurricanes leave behind new landscapes. The Colonel, too, finds a fragile peace. He admits that Alaska will never be solved, never be fully understood. He accepts that love doesn't require comprehension. She loved us in her own way, he says. And in that acceptance, the labyrinth loses some of its power. By the end of part 5, I felt the novel had transformed me. What began as a quirky story about last words and boarding school pranks had become a meditation on mortality, forgiveness, and the messy beauty of being alive. The only way out of the labyrinth of suffering is to forgive. That was Alaska's answer. For Miles, forgiveness is no longer abstract. It's the only way he can keep walking. Forgiveness for Alaska, for himself, for the universe, and for me. That's why Looking for Alaska matters. Because it doesn't just tell us about grief. It gives us tools to carry it. By the time we reach the final chapters of Looking for Alaska, it's tempting to look for redemption, for a neat resolution, for the kind of closure that ties grief into a manageable package. But John Green resists that urge. He knows what all of us eventually learn. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be lived with, and yet, even in that messiness, there's growth. Miles, who once defined himself by trivia and last words, now carries a different kind of knowledge. He has walked through the labyrinth, stumbled, bled, and still found a way to stand. That transformation is the true arc of the novel, not Alaska's death, but the way those left behind learn to carry it. One of the most striking moments is when Miles returns to Dr. Hyde's class to read his essay aloud. He admits, with trembling honesty, "I believe now that we are greater than the sum of our parts. If we are ever irreparably broken, then we are also irreparably joined." To forgive is to admit that we are not perfect. But to love is to know that we are more than our mistakes. It isn't a triumphal speech. It's quiet, vulnerable, the kind of revelation that feels less like an answer and more like a surrender. A surrender to the idea that we will never fully understand each other, never fully prevent pain, but we can still choose compassion. For me, that's where the novel transcends the "ya" label people often pin on it. It isn't just about teenagers at a boarding school. It's about the human condition, about the impossibility of understanding life fully and the necessity of loving anyway. There's an irony in how Alaska remains the novel's great mystery. Even after 200 pages of obsession, grief, and investigation, we still don't know exactly what happened that night. Suicide? Accident? A desperate dash toward memory? Green leaves it deliberately ambiguous. And some readers find that unsatisfying, but I think that's the point. The people we lose are never reducible to clean explanations. We can never fully chart the geography of another person's pain. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to admit we don't know and keep loving them anyway. I think about the way Miles frames it in the end. We cannot be too careful with our words, for they are all we have to fight off oblivion. But we can love with reckless abandon, even if we never solve the mystery. What makes this book so endearing is not its tragedy but its insistence on life. Alaska dies, but she doesn't vanish. She lingers in the pranks they replay, in the books she stacked high, in the cigarette smoke that curls like a ghost above the smoking hole. And she lingers in us, the readers, who carry her contradictions long after closing the cover. When I finished looking for Alaska, I didn't feel tidy closure. I felt cracked open. I thought about the people I'd lost, the labyrinths I'd stumbled through, the ways I had both failed and forgiven myself. And I thought about how books, at their best, don't give us answers, they give us companionship in the questions. That's what John Green has done here. He has written a story that says, you will suffer, you will lose, you will never understand everything, but you are not irreparably broken. You can forgive, you can keep walking, and perhaps most importantly, you can keep searching for your own great perhaps, because that's what Miles wanted at the beginning. Not comfort, not certainty, but possibility. And in the strangest, most painful way, he finds it. The great perhaps is not about escaping the labyrinth. It's about learning to live inside it with courage, humor, and love. Looking back, I realize that's why this book left such an imprint on me. It didn't just remind me of adolescence. It reminded me of being human, of fumbling in the dark, lighting matches one at a time, and laughing with friends even as the smoke stings your eyes. Green's writing is deceptively simple. Short sentences, witty banter, silly pranks, and yet beneath the surface is a river of philosophy, pulsing with questions that have haunted humanity for centuries. What does it mean to live well? How do we forgive? How do we carry grief? How do we face the inevitability of oblivion? The great perhaps was mine to find, and I think I have found it. That closing sentiment isn't about Alaska. It isn't even about Miles alone. It's about all of us. About the possibility that even in our suffering, we can carve meaning. Even in our brokenness, we can love. Even in our labyrinths, we can laugh. And that, for me, is why Looking for Alaska belongs not just in high school backpacks, but on every shelf. It's a reminder that books don't have to solve us. They just have to sit with us. Like a friend on a bad day, like a teacher who listens more than lectures, like a girl named Alaska who was both hurricane and silence. When I close the book, I don't think about the tragedy first. I think about the laughter by the smoking hole, the ridiculous pranks, the whispered confessions, the kiss that felt like a beginning and turned out to be an end, the smell of cigarettes, the sharpness of wine, the joy and terror of being alive at 17, and then I think about forgiveness not as an abstract idea, but as a daily choice. To forgive others for being messy, to forgive ourselves for being imperfect, to forgive the universe for being cruel and beautiful in the same breath. If that's not a great perhaps, I don't know what is. One of the quiet miracles of Looking for Alaska is the way it refuses to leave you in despair. Yes, it's a novel about loss, about a young woman's death that slices through her friends' lives like lightning. But it is also a novel about survival, about the ways friendship and forgiveness keep us afloat when grief threatens to pull us under. In the aftermath of Alaska's death, the friendships at Culver Creek become more than casual bonds. They become lifelines. The Colonel, who has always been Miles's guide into mischief and rebellion, now becomes his partner in survival. Their friendship, tested by guilt and grief, grows into something sturdier. At times, they clash. Miles wants to idealize Alaska, while the colonel demands they see her flaws. But beneath those arguments lies love, both for each other and for the girl they lost. It's fascinating how John Green refuses to let Miles drown in romanticized grief. The colonel acts almost like a corrective force, snapping Miles out of his dangerous idolization. There's a scene where he says, with exasperation, "You can't just make her into whatever you want and call that the truth. She was more complicated than that." That line stuck with me. Because isn't that what we often do when people die? We sand off their rough edges, polish them into saints, turn them into symbols. But people aren't symbols. They're contradictions. To truly love someone is to love their messiness, not to erase it after they're gone. Takumi, too, plays a crucial role in this stage of the story. He is quieter, more introspective, but his friendship is no less vital. He listens, he observes, he occasionally delivers insights that hit like arrows. And then, in his own time, he confesses his guilt. By admitting his silence that night, he lifts a weight Miles thought he carried alone. That moment reminded me how friendship, at its core, is about sharing the unbearable loads, and Lara, sweet, steady Lara, offers Miles something different from Alaska's whirlwind: compassion without chaos. She doesn't demand answers, doesn't try to fix him. She just offers presence. For me, Lara is a reminder that friendship and love don't always have to be hurricanes. Sometimes they are gentle rains that nurture instead of destroy. The theme of forgiveness deepens here, threading its way through every page. Alaska herself once declared, "The only way out of the labyrinth of suffering is to forgive." At the time, it sounded like one of her many paradoxical statements, wise yet unpracticed, sharp yet vague. But after her death, those words echo differently. They become not philosophy, but necessity. Miles wrestles with forgiveness in every direction. Forgiving Alaska for leaving. Forgiving himself for letting her go. Forgiving the universe for dealing out tragedy without explanation. Forgiveness doesn't come quickly. It arrives in fragments, in late-night realizations, in laughter that doesn't taste like betrayal anymore. What Green illustrates beautifully is that forgiveness is not a single act but an ongoing practice. You don't wake up one morning absolved of guilt. You choose forgiveness every day, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. And with each choice, the labyrinth feels a little less suffocating. I was particularly struck by the way humor survives alongside grief. Even after Alaska's death, the colonel still swears in imaginative ways, still plots mischief, still manages to make Miles laugh when he least expects it. That laughter is not disrespect. It's survival. There's a passage where Miles reflects, "If people were rain, I was drizzle and she was a hurricane." We've heard this before, but in the after, it changes tone. It's no longer about romantic longing. It's about acceptance. He is drizzle. She was hurricane. And now he must live with being drizzle in a world without her storm. One of the most moving sections is when the group organizes a prank in Alaska's honor. They plot, plan, and execute the grandest prank Culver Creek has ever seen, unleashing chaos across campus. It's loud, hilarious, absurd, and it feels holy. Because in that moment, they aren't just pranking. They're resurrecting Alaska's spirit, letting her laughter echo once more. I cried when I read that scene, because it captured something I've felt in my own life: the way joy can become a form of memorial. We don't only honor the dead with candles and tears. We honor them by living the parts of life they loved, by laughing the way they laughed, by dancing the way they danced, by refusing to let their memory be swallowed by silence. The prank is also a turning point for Miles and the colonel. It doesn't erase their grief, but it loosens its grip. For a night, they're not victims of tragedy, they're creators of joy. And that joy feels like rebellion against the cruelty of loss. At the same time, the novel acknowledges that friendship can't fix everything. The labyrinth still exists. The pain still lingers. But friends make the labyrinth bearable. They walk beside you when you can't walk alone. And in that companionship, forgiveness slowly becomes possible. I think about my own friendships when I read these passages, the ones that have carried me through heartbreak, illness, disappointment. We often undervalue the quiet heroism of friends who sit with us in the dark, who don't demand we move on before we're ready. This novel reminded me that those friendships are not just comforting, they are life-saving. John Green has often said in interviews that Looking for Alaska is, at its heart, a book about empathy. And I believe him. The novel asks us to look at Alaska not as an archetype or a puzzle to be solved, but as a person, a flawed, brilliant, hurting person. And it asks us to do the same with ourselves. There's a moment when Miles reflects on Alaska's contradictions, her kindness, her cruelty, her brilliance, her recklessness. He realizes that none of those pieces cancel the others out. She was all of it, all at once. And loving her meant accepting that she could never be simplified. Isn't that what forgiveness truly is? To love someone without reducing them to their worst mistake. To accept that they are more than the sum of their contradictions. When I finished this part of the novel, I found myself thinking less about Alaska's death and more about the friendships that survived her. They didn't save her. They couldn't, but they saved each other. And that, too, is a kind of miracle. We need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken. Those words, repeated near the end, feel like the book's final gift. Hope doesn't mean we erase the labyrinth. It means we keep walking through it, hand in hand. Drizzle and hurricanes alike. It's been nearly 20 years since Looking for Alaska first landed in bookstores. Yet the novel still sparks conversations. Still finds its way into teenage backpacks and adult nightstands. That kind of longevity is rare, especially in young adult literature, which so often feels tied to a particular cultural moment. And yet, John Green's debut continues to resonate. The question is, why? Part of the answer lies in timing. When the book was published in 2005, YA fiction was experiencing a renaissance. But most of the best-selling titles leaned heavily on fantasy, dystopia, or paranormal romance. Green, by contrast, gave us teenagers who weren't chosen ones or vampire lovers. They were kids sneaking cigarettes, pulling pranks, debating philosophy, and grappling with mortality. It was raw, unvarnished, startlingly honest. For a generation raised on glossy teen dramas, it felt like someone had finally handed them a mirror instead of a fairy tale, but longevity requires more than novelty. What has kept Looking for Alaska alive is its refusal to simplify the complexity of adolescence. Many books about teenagers, even good ones, tend to flatten the experience into digestible lessons. Green does the opposite. He hands us contradictions, joy tangled with despair, cruelty with tenderness, profundity with stupidity, and in doing so, he captures something timeless. Consider the line that has become almost mythic: if people were rain, I was drizzle and she was a hurricane. It's been quoted endlessly, printed on posters, tattooed on wrists. Cynics dismiss it as teenage melodrama. But for readers, especially young ones, it rings true because adolescence is melodramatic. Feelings arrive like hurricanes, overwhelming and unmanageable. To dismiss that as immature is to forget what it's like to be 16. Green respects his characters enough to take their emotions seriously, and in doing so, he respects his readers. Another reason the novel endures is its fearless engagement with taboo topics. Looking for Alaska has been banned, challenged, and censored in schools across the United States for its frank depictions of sex, smoking, drinking, and death. Ironically, those very controversies only cemented its place in literary history. Because here's the truth, teenagers already live with these realities. Pretending otherwise doesn't protect them, it isolates them. Green's willingness to portray adolescence in its messy fullness is precisely what made so many readers feel seen. I remember reading about those book bans and shaking my head. The complaints were always the same. It glorifies smoking, it's too sexual, it's inappropriate for young readers, but the reality is that Green doesn't glorify. He contextualizes. He shows teenagers making reckless choices, yes, but he also shows the consequences, the hangovers, the guilt, the grief. To censor those depictions is to deny teenagers the chance to process their own contradictions through story. And let's not forget, the very scene most frequently cited in censorship debates, the awkward sexual encounter between Miles and Lara, is not titillating but hilariously unsexy. It's clumsy, uncomfortable, and, dare I say, educational in its honesty. Green refuses to romanticize intimacy. Instead, he presents it as part of the fumbling, embarrassing process of growing up. Beyond controversies, though, what gives Looking for Alaska staying power is its philosophy. Few YA novels dare to grapple so directly with existential questions: the nature of suffering, the possibility of forgiveness, the inevitability of death. These are questions as old as humanity itself, and yet Green filters them through teenage voices without condescension. The result is a book that speaks simultaneously to 16-year-olds and 60-year-olds. Take Alaska's haunting question: how will I ever get out of this labyrinth? That question echoes far beyond adolescence. Adults wrestle with it, too, in marriages, in careers, in hospitals, in moments of quiet despair. Green doesn't provide a single answer. He offers a chorus of possibilities. For Alaska, the labyrinth was unbearable suffering. For Miles, it became the messy beauty of life. For readers, it's whatever personal tangle we find ourselves lost in. The book's gift is not in solving the labyrinth but in validating that we are all stumbling through one. The influence of Looking for Alaska also extends to the broader landscape of YA literature. It helped carve a path for what some critics call cyclit books about teenagers grappling with illness, death, or trauma. Without Alaska, we might not have seen the same level of success for novels like The Fault in Our Stars, also by Green, or 13 Reasons Why, or All the Bright Places. Love them or critique them, these books reshaped the market, proving that young readers could handle and craved stories that didn't shy away from pain. But influence is not the same as imitation. What distinguishes Looking for Alaska is its humor. For every gut punch about death, there's a belly laugh about pranks, an eye roll at the eagle's sternness, a sarcastic jab from the colonel. Green knows that grief and comedy are not opposites but companions, and that balance is what makes the novel rereadable even for adults who know the ending. Rereading Looking for Alaska as an adult is an entirely different experience than encountering it at 16. When I first read it, I was enthralled by Alaska's chaos, by the rush of cigarette smoke and whispered secrets in dorm rooms, by the reckless urgency of every kiss and prank. Back then, the book felt like permission to feel too much, to want too much, to believe that life could be electric if only I dared to seek my own great perhaps. But years later, the novel hits differently. Now, I see the warning signs in Alaska's behavior, the fragility beneath her bravado, the desperate sadness that teenagers often mask with laughter. I notice the guilt in her words: I smoke to die, and instead of finding it edgy or provocative, I hear a cry for help. Age changes the way you listen. This is part of what makes the book so enduring. It grows with its readers. At 16, you read it as a mirror. At 30, you read it as a memory. At 50, you may read it as a reminder of the labyrinth you've walked through and survived. The same sentences refract into new meanings depending on where you stand in life. Take Alaska's haunting question: how will I ever get out of this labyrinth? As a teenager, I read that line and thought, yes, life feels like a maze and I'll never escape it. As an adult, I read it and think, the labyrinth doesn't end, but I've learned to make peace with the walls. It's not about escape anymore. It's about endurance, about learning to carry suffering without letting it hollow you out completely. Miles's transformation, too, looks different through older eyes. As a teenager, I admired his courage for leaving Florida in search of adventure. Now, I see his naivete, his projection, his idolization of Alaska. I recognize in him the mistake we all make at some point, confusing another person for salvation. It's a mistake not limited to adolescence. Adults do it too. But Green shows us, through Miles's grief, that no one can bear the weight of being someone else's great perhaps. There's a subtle humor in rereading teenage angst as an adult. For example, the elaborate pranks that once felt world-shattering now read as both hilarious and tender. The blue dye, the fake IDs, the elaborate lies told to the eagle, all of it feels so small compared to the vastness of adult responsibilities. And yet, that's the genius of the book. It reminds us that, at 16, those small rebellions felt like revolutions. They mattered because they were ours. I remember laughing out loud at the scene where Miles and the Colonel get caught in a prank gone wrong, sputtering excuses while covered in evidence. As an adult, I see the eagle less as a villain and more as a weary man trying to wrangle chaos. Perspective shifts everything, but the grief hasn't lessened with age. If anything, it cuts deeper. Because by adulthood, most of us have experienced loss firsthand. We've received the phone call, sat through the funeral, wrestled with the absurdity of an empty chair at the dinner table. Reading about Alaska's sudden absence now feels less like fiction and more like recognition. Miles's guilt resonates differently too. His endless replay of that final night, what if he had stopped her? What if he had asked the right question, feels achingly familiar. Who among us hasn't done the same after a loss? Rewound the tape in our minds, searching for the moment we could have changed the ending? As an adult, I know what Miles doesn't yet. That guilt is not logic. It's grief wearing a mask. Another detail that lands differently with age is Alaska's life's library, her towering stacks of unread books. As a teenager, I saw it as quirky, romantic, almost glamorous. Now, I see it as tragic, a visual reminder of how much she longed for more time. As adults, we all carry our own life's library, the unread books, the unrevealed places, the unspoken words. The older you get, the heavier that stack feels, and yet, there's also comfort in recognizing yourself in these pages years later. It means the book hasn't aged into irrelevance. It has aged into universality. Alaska's chaos, Miles's longing, the Colonel's rage, these aren't just teenage dramas. They're human dramas, replayed in different forms across every decade of our lives. One of the most powerful lessons the novel offers, one I only fully grasped as an adult, is that forgiveness is not optional. It's survival. We need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken. At 16, that line sounded like encouragement. At 30, it sounds like gospel. It's not about blind optimism. It's about resilience. It's about realizing that even in our deepest pain, some part of us remains whole enough to keep going. That forgiveness of others, of ourselves, of the world's cruelty, is the only way forward. Reading the book again, I also felt a pang of protectiveness toward teenagers who encounter it for the first time. I wanted to lean over their shoulders and whisper, "Yes, you will feel this deeply. Yes, it will hurt. But you will survive it." In that sense, the novel is both a warning and a promise. It warns that life will break you, but it promises you are not irreparably broken. Perhaps that's why the book resonates across ages. It doesn't talk down to young readers, and it doesn't bore older ones. It honors the seriousness of teenage emotions while also inviting adults to remember, to empathize, to reflect, and let's be honest, part of the novel's staying power is also John Green's voice. His writing blends wit with weight, humor with heartbreak. Few authors can shift from a joke about the eagle's overzealous punishments to a meditation on oblivion without making the transition feel jarring. Green makes it seamless, because that's how life feels. One moment you're laughing, the next you're crying, and often both at once. As an adult, I find myself less enchanted by Alaska's mystery and more moved by the friendships that remain after her death. The Colonel, Takumi, Lara, they embody the truth that no matter how devastating loss is, we survive through each other. The labyrinth is never walked alone. I think that's the gift of rereading Looking for Alaska later in life. It shifts the focus from the tragedy of Alaska's death to the resilience of those who loved her. It reminds us that the people we lose are not the end of our story. They are part of the chapters we carry forward. So yes, the book feels different with age. But that difference is precisely what makes it timeless. It refuses to stay fixed in adolescence. It grows as we grow. It mirrors our labyrinths at every stage, reflecting back whatever questions we're wrestling with in that season of life. And maybe that's the ultimate great, perhaps, the possibility that a story can walk with us across decades, evolving as we evolve, reminding us always that while suffering is inevitable, hopelessness is not. Literary works rarely exist in isolation. They echo, they borrow, they collide with other texts across time. Looking for Alaska is no exception. One of the reasons the novel has had such a lasting cultural impact is because it doesn't just tell a story. It joins a much older conversation about adolescence, suffering, and the search for meaning. At first glance, the novel sits comfortably within the tradition of the boarding school story. Think A Separate Piece by John Knowles, or G.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Each of these novels places young characters in enclosed academic environments, where friendships intensify, rivalries sharpen, and identity is forged in crucibles of pressure. Culver Creek may not be as polished as Devon School or as bleak as Holden Caulfield's New York Wanderings, but the DNA is the same. The boarding school is never just a backdrop, it's a stage where the drama of growing up unfolds in sharper relief. But Green goes further. Where Knowles gave us jealousy and betrayal, and Salinger gave us cynicism and alienation, Green offers philosophy. He puts existential questions directly into his characters' mouths, daring his teenage protagonists to wrestle with God, death, and forgiveness. It's a bold choice, and one that risks pretension. But it works because Green roots the philosophy in messy humanity. Alaska's Labyrinth is not a sterile classroom debate, it's the anguish of a girl haunted by her mother's death. Miles's search for last words is not a quirky hobby, it's a longing for meaning in the face of mortality. The influence of Latin American literature also pulses through the novel, particularly Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Alaska's obsession with the general in his Labyrinth is more than a passing reference. It's a thematic cornerstone. Marquez's dying general, trapped in a metaphorical labyrinth of memory and regret, becomes Alaska's mirror. Her desperate question, "How will I ever get out of this labyrinth?" echoes across centuries, from Marquez's prose to Green's Alabama boarding school. Literature, after all, is a dialogue, and Green makes sure his young readers know they are part of it. And then, of course, there is the book's afterlife in culture. For years, Looking for Alaska was the John Green novel that didn't get a blockbuster adaptation. While The Fault in Our Stars became a Hollywood tearjerker and Paper Towns had its film debut, Alaska remained elusive. Rumors swirled for over a decade, directors attached, scripts written, deals collapsing. It wasn't until 2019 that the story finally found its screen form, not as a film but as an 8-part miniseries on Hulu. I remember approaching the series with both anticipation and dread. Adaptations are always treacherous, especially for books that feel intimate, personal. Could actors capture Alaska's chaos without turning her into kitsch? Could the show preserve the philosophical weight without becoming pretentious? The series, to its credit, leaned into the book's structure. It kept the before and after countdown, building dread toward the inevitable. It gave space for the pranks, the laughter, the friendships. And it gave Alaska dimension, more screen time, more interiority, more acknowledgement of her trauma. For many viewers, this deepened her character, softening the manic pixie critique. For others, no performance could match the Alaska they had imagined in their heads. And perhaps that's the curse of adaptation. No camera can film the hurricane we construct in our own minds. Still, the series brought the story to a new audience, many of whom had never picked up the book. That, in itself, is valuable. Stories live longer when they take on new forms. Culturally, Looking for Alaska also sparked conversations about representation in YA fiction. Some readers praised the book for portraying teenagers as intelligent, complex, and capable of grappling with philosophy. Others criticized its lack of diversity. Culver Creek is not a particularly representative school in terms of race or sexuality. These critiques are fair. Literature can be groundbreaking in one area while limited in another. Part of loving a book is holding it accountable for both its brilliance and its blind spots. But perhaps the most significant cultural echo is the way Alaska's character has been debated, defended, and reinterpreted. Is she a manic pixie dream girl? Is she a fully realized human? Is she both? The phrase manic pixie dream girl itself exploded into pop culture discourse around the same time the novel was released. Used to critique characters like Natalie Portman's in Garden State or Kirsten Dunst's in Elizabethtown, Alaska inevitably got pulled into the conversation. John Green himself has addressed this, insisting that Alaska was never meant to be a device for Miles's growth but a person with her own contradictions. Whether readers agree depends, perhaps, on what they bring to the book. Teen readers often see Alaska as dazzling and tragic. Older readers see her as wounded and unreachable. Either way, the fact that we're still arguing about her 2 decades later speaks to the power of her presence on the page. In literary terms, Looking for Alaska also opened the floodgates for what some call the literary ya movement, novels that blend teenage voices with stylistic ambition and philosophical weight. Writers like David Levithan, Rainbow Rowell, and Angie Thomas owe something, directly or indirectly, to Green's willingness to treat adolescence with gravity, and let's not underestimate the book's influence on how we talk about grief. Before Alaska, ya fiction often treated death as a plot twist or a moral lesson. Green insisted it was neither. Death, in his novel, is a wound that doesn't heal neatly. It's a labyrinth you never fully escape. That honesty changed the landscape, making space for stories that respect young readers enough to tell them the truth. What fascinates me most, though, is how Looking for Alaska manages to be both deeply American and oddly universal. The setting in Alabama boarding school with pranks, football games, and Thanksgiving breaks is distinctly Southern, yet the themes mortality, forgiveness, longing resonate across borders. The novel has been translated into dozens of languages, read in classrooms from Tokyo to Warsaw. The Labyrinth, it turns out, is not bound by geography. There's also the irony that a novel so obsessed with last words has produced so many quotable lines of its own. Fans can recite them like scripture. The only way out of the labyrinth of suffering is to forgive. If people were rain, I was drizzle and she was a hurricane. I go to seek a great perhaps. These phrases have left the page and entered the cultural lexicon, painted on dorm walls, scribbled in notebooks, whispered at funerals. In that sense, John Green gave his readers their own last words to carry sentences that help crystallize what often feels inexpressible. And maybe that's the highest calling of literature, not to provide answers, but to give us language for the questions. When I look at the legacy of Looking for Alaska, I see a novel that dared to take teenagers seriously, dared to put philosophy in their mouths, dared to tell them the truth about death. I see a book that bridged the gap between adolescence and adulthood, offering companionship to readers at every stage. And I see a story that, like Alaska herself, refuses to be simplified. Was it perfect? No, but perfection was never the point. The point was to say, life is messy, suffering is real, forgiveness is possible, and love, though it may not save us, matters anyway. And in that sense, the echoes of Looking for Alaska will continue long after the pranks at Culver Creek fade into memory. Because every generation will ask, how do I get out of this labyrinth? And every generation will need a story that reminds them, you may never escape, but you are not alone in it. One of the most remarkable features of Looking for Alaska is its language. John Green doesn't just tell a story. He hands us phrases that linger long after the plot has faded. They're the kind of sentences that end up scrawled in journals, taped to mirrors, whispered between friends. In many ways, the book is less about what happens than about what is said and how those words echo in the reader's labyrinth. Let's begin with the most famous of them all, if people were rain. I was drizzle and she was a hurricane. This metaphor has been quoted so often it risks kitsch. And yet when you encounter it in the book, it feels freshly devastating. Miles is trying to articulate the imbalance between himself and Alaska, his quiet ordinariness against her chaotic brilliance. As teenagers, many of us feel like drizzle in the presence of someone else's storm. And as adults, we still feel it, though we might use different metaphors. What's powerful here is the humility. Miles isn't glorifying himself. He's admitting his smallness in the face of her intensity. And yet, drizzle and hurricane are both rain, both part of the same cycle. It's a reminder that even in our ordinariness, we belong to the same world as the extraordinary. Another line that cuts deep is Alaska's confession, you all smoke to enjoy it. I smoke to die. At first, it sounds like bravado, teenage edginess packaged for shock value. But within the context of her trauma, her guilt over her mother's death, it becomes chilling. It's not just a quip, it's an admission of despair. Readers often debate whether this line foreshadows her death, but for me, its power lies in its raw honesty. Alaska isn't trying to be poetic. She's telling the truth no one else wants to hear. That's why it unsettles us. And then there's the line that frames the entire novel, borrowed from François Rabelais's supposed last words. I go to seek a great perhaps, for miles. This becomes a mission statement, a justification for leaving behind the safety of his suburban life. It's adventurous, hopeful, even romantic. But by the end of the novel, the phrase takes on a heavier resonance. The great perhaps isn't just about adventure, it's about meaning itself. It's about believing that life is more than pain, more than routine, more than the labyrinth of suffering. As adults, we may not call it a great perhaps, but we all chase it in some form: love, art, purpose, legacy. The brilliance of this line is its vagueness. It's a blank canvas onto which every reader can project their own longing. And then, of course, Alaska's haunting question: how will I ever get out of this labyrinth? This is the gravitational center of the book. It's the question she asks over and over, the one she never answers. The labyrinth represents suffering, guilt, life itself. For Alaska, the labyrinth is unbearable. For Miles, by the end, the labyrinth is survivable, even meaningful. What makes the line so devastating is its lack of resolution. The novel doesn't tell us how to get out. It tells us that the question itself shapes our lives. Miles's eventual answer comes in his essay for Dr. Hyde: we need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken. This is the book's heartbeat. It's not denial. Miles doesn't claim grief disappears or wounds vanish. Instead, he insists on resilience. Brokenness is real, but not final. Forgiveness is possible. Healing is partial but powerful. For me, this line captures the delicate balance of hope, not naive optimism, but the conviction that despair is not the final word. Another striking quote comes from the Colonel. Ever the pragmatist amidst philosophy, the only thing worse than being poor at Culver Creek is being poor and quiet. It's a line that blends humor with social critique. The Colonel knows the hierarchy of their school, knows how wealth and privilege dominate, but instead of wallowing, he weaponizes humor. It's his way of asserting dignity. I love this line because it shows how the book balances existential weight with sharp wit. It reminds us that philosophy doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears sneakers and swears colorfully. There are also the quieter, tender quotes, the ones that don't get plastered on posters but linger in your chest. Like Alaska's reflection on her life's library: when I look at my shelves, I see my unfinished life. I want to read them all, but I'll never have the time. This line resonates differently at different ages. As a teenager, it felt like an exciting challenge, a dare to devour as many books as possible. As an adult, it feels like an admission of mortality. We will never read everything, never do everything, never love enough, never finish the shelves of our lives. And yet, the longing itself is beautiful. The stacks of unread books are not just absence, they're possibility. What unites all these quotes is their accessibility. Green writes in language simple enough for a teenager to grasp, yet layered enough for adults to wrestle with. That's why these sentences live beyond the book. They migrate into tattoos, yearbook quotes, Instagram captions, eulogies. They become part of the reader's own vocabulary for pain and hope. It's worth noting, too, that last words, Miles's obsession, frame the novel's entire philosophy. Famous last words are often romanticized, turned into aphorisms. But Alaska's last words never come. Miles never gets the closure he craved. That absence is, in itself, a kind of quote. The silence that teaches him more than any sentence could. In the end, Green suggests that the most profound last words may be the ones we never hear. For me, the power of these quotes lies not in their cleverness but in their resonance. They don't just sound good. They feel true. They name things we've all felt but couldn't articulate: the smallness beside someone else's brilliance, the despair hidden in reckless habits, the longing for meaning beyond routine, the fragility of hope. Sometimes, I think that's why Looking for Alaska has endured more than plot-driven YA novels from the same era. Plots age, cultural references fade, but language that articulates universal emotions that lasts. I often imagine a teenager scribbling "I go to seek a great perhaps" in the margins of their notebook, not knowing that 20 years later, they'll still be chasing that same, perhaps in their career, their marriage, their art, or an adult whispering we need never be hopeless to themselves after a breakup or a diagnosis. That's the gift of this novel. It equips us with words for our labyrinths, and perhaps that's why John Green's sentences feel almost liturgical. They aren't just lines in a book. They're mantras, prayers, confessions. They're the language we carry into our own suffering. The words we mutter when silence is unbearable. As I come to the end of Looking for Alaska, I realize that the novel doesn't close with the neatness of a bow. It closes with the openness of a door. John Green doesn't tell us what to think about Alaska's death. He doesn't solve the mystery, doesn't soothe us with certainty. Instead, he leaves us with fragments: grief, laughter, questions, forgiveness. And perhaps that's why the book endures. It refuses to give us the illusion of finality. The before and after structure is genius in its simplicity. It reminds us that life can be divided in an instant: before the phone call, after the diagnosis, before the accident, after the silence. Every one of us has a line like that in our lives, a point after which nothing was ever the same. By structuring the novel this way, Green gives language to that fracture, and yet, the novel is not nihilistic. It doesn't leave us in despair. It leaves us in forgiveness. Miles's essay, his final attempt to answer Alaska's question, insists, we need never be hopeless, because we can never be irreparably broken. That sentence doesn't erase suffering, but it reframes it. Brokenness isn't final. It's part of being human. Forgiveness isn't a cure, but it's a way to keep breathing. To me, that's the true great perhaps of the novel, not adventure or romance, but resilience. The possibility that even in the labyrinth, there is a way forward. What also stays with me is how ordinary the tragedy is. Alaska doesn't die in some symbolic, heroic act. She dies in a car accident, perhaps caused by recklessness, perhaps by grief. It's mundane, almost cruelly so. But isn't that what loss often is? Sudden, ordinary, senseless. Green resists the temptation to dramatize it into legend. He shows us the banality of tragedy, and then he shows us how friends carry each other through it. Friendship, in fact, may be the book's greatest theme. Yes, it's about grief. Yes, it's about love. But most of all, it's about how we survive through each other. The Colonel's loyalty, Takumi's quiet honesty, Lara's gentleness, these are the ropes Miles clings to in the labyrinth. Alaska is unforgettable, but it's her absence that reveals the strength of those who remain, and let's not forget the humor. For all its tragedy, Looking for Alaska is also full of belly laughs. The pranks, the Colonel's wit, the awkward sexual encounters, they keep the book from drowning in sorrow. That balance is why it works. Life is never only grief or only joy. It's always both, colliding in messy, unpredictable ways. Another reason the novel matters is its honesty about adolescence. Too often, stories about teenagers either trivialize their feelings or romanticize them into absurdity. Green does neither. He takes them seriously. He lets them be profound and foolish in the same breath. He respects them enough to give them philosophy, humor, love, and loss in their full intensity. And in doing so, he respects his readers, teenagers and adults alike. When I think about Alaska Young, I don't think of her as a symbol. I think of her as a person, brilliant, reckless, cruel, kind, unforgettable. I think of her stacks of books, her cigarette smoke, her laughter echoing in the woods. I think of her contradictions. And maybe that's the most loving way to remember someone, not as an idea, but as a collection of contradictions we choose to hold anyway. The novel has been called controversial, even dangerous. It has been banned in schools, challenged by parents, dissected by critics. But to me, that controversy is proof of its power. Books that provoke discomfort are often the ones that tell the truth. Teenagers drink. They smoke. They grieve. They laugh in cemeteries. They debate God and oblivion. To pretend otherwise is to leave them unprepared for the labyrinth, and perhaps that's why Looking for Alaska has lasted. It doesn't patronize. It doesn't sanitize. It tells young readers, your feelings matter. Your questions matter. Your pain matters. And it tells older readers, remember, Remember when everything felt like a hurricane, when love and grief arrived with the same intensity. Remember that you survived and that you're still searching for your great perhaps. There's a line I keep coming back to: the only way out of the labyrinth of suffering is to forgive. At first, it feels like Alaska's philosophy, one of her many cryptic declarations. But by the end, it becomes the reader's invitation. Forgive the people who left. Forgive yourself for what you couldn't prevent. Forgive the universe for being both cruel and beautiful. Forgiveness doesn't solve the labyrinth, but it makes walking through it possible. And so, what do we take from this book, nearly 20 years later? We take its honesty, its humor, its pain. We take Alaska's hurricane and Miles's drizzle and remember that both are part of being alive. We take the reminder that we are not irreparably broken. More than anything, we take companionship. Because looking for Alaska doesn't give us closure, but it does give us company. It sits with us in our labyrinths, whispers our questions back to us, and tells us we're not alone in asking them. And in a world that so often demands answers, maybe that's the greatest gift a novel can give. Imagining the future is a kind of nostalgia. Yes, it is. And reading this book again is its own kind of nostalgia, a reminder of who we were, who we are, and who we still hope to be. In the end, the great perhaps isn't Alaska's or Miles's alone. It's ours. It's the possibility that even in the face of loss, love and laughter are still worth seeking. It's the promise that while we may never escape the labyrinth entirely, we can forgive, endure, and even find joy within its walls. That's why Looking for Alaska is still worth reading. Not because it answers our questions, but because it asks them with us. Not because it saves us, but because it walks beside us. And that, I think, is enough.